Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we begin, let me remind you that if you're liking our initiatives, do let us know in the comment section below and also subscribe to our channel. So let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this article, the writer evaluates the climate action commitments that countries have taken up during the recently concluded climate change summit. Just a few weeks back, the 26th Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Change Convention was held at Glasgow in the United Kingdom, and the participating countries have taken up several new commitments and pledges. So, this article gives us an opportunity to evaluate these commitments in detail and also to understand the writer's argument that as far as the new commitments are concerned, a clear divide has again emerged between the global south and the global north. See, in geopolitics and international relations, when we use the terms global south and global north, it essentially refers to developing countries and least developed countries and the developed nations, respectively. According to the writer, when it comes to climate action, developing countries like India and even the least developed countries, they are burdened with several challenges and they cannot be expected to fulfill their climate action commitments without the right assistance from the developed north. So, in this context, he calls for a new climate of cooperation between the global south and the global north in order to help the world successfully achieve the new pledges and commitments that were taken up at COP26. But before we go into the details of the article, first let's understand the new pledges and commitments that were taken up, along with India's position on these new commitments. See, as per the climate action goals that have been laid down under the Paris Agreement of 2015, the global target is to limit the global rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius and if possible to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century as compared to pre-industrial levels. To achieve this target, countries took up voluntary contributions known as INDCs or intended nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Now, since it's believed that these voluntary contributions won't be enough to achieve the Paris targets, countries have been trying at subsequent climate summits to further raise their ambition by increasing their near term and long term goals in order to cut and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and arrange for adequate finance for these efforts so that substantial investments can be made in the relevant areas, especially in developing nations, with financial and technical support coming from the developed nations. So, this has been the focus of every climate change summit. The focus is to raise ambition, focus on cutting emissions, and raise global finance to help the developing countries and the least developed countries to achieve their climate targets. These measures are expected to help the world achieve the temperature targets as laid down under the Paris Agreement, along with implementing adequate adaptation measures to particularly help the developing nations and the least developed countries to adapt their vulnerable communities against the adverse impact of climate change. So, with these objectives in mind, countries met at COP26 and they have adopted four new targets or four new pledges. This includes a goal to end deforestation, to achieve net zero emissions within a prescribed deadline, to quit and end the consumption of coal, and to cut methane emissions. So, these four new targets were the focus area at COP26, and it's very important for us to understand what is India's position on these new commitments. See, out of these four new targets, India has agreed to take up just one, that is to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. But it has refused to sign the agreements related to ending deforestation, quitting the consumption of coal, and cutting methane emissions. See, for ending deforestation, at the Glasgow summit, the Declaration on Forest and Land Use was signed and adopted by more than 141 countries. This declaration aims to conserve and restore forests over the next decade with a pledge to end deforestation by 2030. The declaration also focuses on reversing deforestation by the end of this decade. And for achieving these targets, a financial support of around $19.2 billion has been worked out. The idea is to protect our forest areas from deforestation and even to reverse deforestation so that forests, as natural carbon sinks, can help in removing the excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are directly contributing to global warming. In this table, you can see the list of countries which have signed this declaration, and it includes major countries and large emitters such as United States, several European countries, and as well as Russia and Brazil. Even China, the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has signed on to the declaration. But however, India, the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has opted to stay out of this declaration. The next pledge is with regard to phasing out coal. During the Glasgow summit, the Coal to Clean Power Transition Agreement was signed, under which 40 countries have agreed to phase out coal consumption, whereas 23 countries have agreed to stop constructing and issuing permits for new coal power plants. Under this agreement, even major international banks and finance institutions have committed to end international public financing of coal power projects by the end of this year. But however, some of the world's largest producers and consumers of coal, such as China, India, US, and Australia, have not signed on to this agreement, as these countries still heavily rely upon coal based energy. In the case of India, for example, nearly 60% of our electricity comes from coal based sources, and hence India is not in an immediate position to phase out coal because committing to such an immediate transition will incur a huge socio-economic cost on developing countries like India. See, this graphic clearly depicts the top consumers and producers of coal, and major emitters like US, China, India, Australia, and the others have refused to sign on to this agreement. Whereas more than 40 countries depicted in the map over here have agreed to phase out coal from their energy basket. Then the third agreement deals with reducing methane emissions. The Glasgow summit came out with a global methane pledge, which aims to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by the end of this decade. See, methane is considered as one of the most potent greenhouse gases because of its high global warming potential. It has a higher potency to trap more heat in the atmosphere than even carbon dioxide, and hence several countries are pledging to bring down their methane emissions. But the top three emitters of methane, that is China, Russia, and India, have not signed this pledge because adopting this commitment will have economic consequences across several industries and as well as over the agriculture sector, which are all responsible for methane emissions. So if you look at this chart, it depicts the top three methane emitters, and they have not signed the global methane pledge, which has been agreed to by more than 100 countries. Then finally, coming to net zero emission targets, more than 137 countries have committed to net zero target, but developed countries such as US, Canada, and countries of Europe have taken up an earlier deadline, and they have pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Then top emitters like China have set a target of 2060 to achieve net zero emissions. India, being the third largest emitter, was under tremendous pressure from these countries to also declare a net zero emission target, and accordingly, India has taken up this target but with a longer deadline of 2070. So, as you can see, out of the four new targets that were taken up at COP26, India has agreed to take up only one target, that is net zero emissions, that too with a longer deadline, whereas India has refused to sign on to other three commitments. Now, this doesn't mean that India isn't doing enough to combat climate change. In fact, India has been making serious efforts to adopt renewable energy in order to considerably bring down its greenhouse gas emissions. As far as India's voluntary targets are concerned under the Paris Agreement, India is one of the few countries which has been serious about adopting renewable energy, and it has even displayed global leadership. To achieve this transition towards renewable forms of energy, India has already built up an installed capacity of 22.5% out of its total sources of electricity. During the summit, Prime Minister Modi has even enhanced these targets, and India has pledged to have an installed capacity of 500 gigawatts by 2030 coming from renewable sources, along with 50% of its electricity demands being met through non fossil sources. When it comes to adopting solar energy, India has displayed global leadership by co founding the International Solar Alliance along with France, which was launched during the Paris Summit of 2015. Today, more than 120 countries have joined the International Solar Alliance, and India is leading global efforts to boost the adoption of solar energy. Then, at the national level, India has launched the National Green Hydrogen Mission to adopt hydrogen fuel as a cleaner alternative in order to move away from carbon emitting fossil fuels. Then India also joined the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda along with 35 other countries, which aims to promote the adoption of clean energy in order to make renewable forms of energy more affordable. Despite these appreciable efforts being taken up by India in the field of renewable energy, a lot more needs to be done in order to help India achieve its ambitious targets. But however, unlike the developed nations of the global north, India, as a developing country of the global south, faces several unique challenges. As India is home to the second largest population in the world, it's not easy for a country like India to meet its consumption needs. And this consumption demand is only going to go up as India is all set to become the world's most populous nation. Then, upon that, the clean and renewable energy options are very limited, and this further restricts India's plans to diversify its renewable sources. And finally, to carry out any such large scale transition towards cleaner and renewable forms of energy, India would require the latest technology along with massive financial support to achieve this transition. A recent report has already estimated that if India aims to achieve its target of 175 gigawatts of renewable power by the year 2022, then it will require investments to the tune of $2.61 trillion, which is no doubt very challenging to arrange for a developing country like India. See, for top emitters like US and China, it's much more easier to achieve the transition as they are heavily relying upon nuclear power to scale down their dependency on fossil fuels. Even though India has its own nuclear ambitions, it can't match up to the US or China in the nuclear domain because it faces a huge resource constraint with regard to nuclear material, as India is still not a member of the nuclear suppliers group. Then, for smaller developed countries of Europe, like Iceland and Norway, it's much more easier to achieve 100% transition towards clean and renewable forms of energy because of their small population and the limited consumption demand of these countries. For these small developed nations, just one source of renewable energy, such as hydropower or solar power or geothermal energy, is sufficient to meet the consumption needs of their small population, and hence it's much easier for them to achieve a 100% transition. But for a large and populous country like India, which is still struggling with its developmental needs, achieving such a transition through one single source is not possible. So India will have to rely upon different forms of renewable energy, and this transition will require massive investments in technology, thereby raising challenges with regard to finance. In the current economic context, India will find it very difficult to make these investments because of the ongoing structural slowdown in the economy since 2016, which has been further amplified by the impact of the pandemic. So, this struggle is not just limited to developing countries like India, but it is also shared by many other developing nations and especially by least developed countries. It is in this context that the writer argues that the global south requires more support from the global north in line with the principle of CBDR. CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. This was the core principle of the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997, which was the first key agreement under the Climate Change Summit. This principle provides for climate justice as it mandates the developed countries to do more in assisting the developing nations and underdeveloped nations as a part of their historical responsibilities. In line with this principle, the global north had committed to provide climate finance and even assist developing nations and smaller countries with technology so that they could implement their transition and adaptation measures. As part of this climate finance, the developed nations had committed to provide for $100 billion every year to the global south so that they could help out the developing and underdeveloped nations to achieve their climate action targets. Hence, the writer is of the opinion that developing economies like India face several unique challenges with regard to climate action, and hence they require the support of the developed North. So he calls for a new climate of cooperation to help the developing and underdeveloped countries achieve their COP26 pledges. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, in which retired Lieutenant General Naresh Chand evaluates the sense of alienation being faced by Kashmiri youth. He argues that decades of militancy in Jammu and Kashmir and the harsh response by the Indian state against cross-border terrorism, accompanied with the lack of development in Jammu and Kashmir, has ended up breeding a strong sense of alienation amongst the Kashmiri youth. So to win over the hearts and minds of the Kashmiri youth and to make them feel belonged, the writer suggests a more professional and softer approach based on long-term strategies as a solution. This debate has come up in the context of few controversial statements made by the Chief of Defence Staff. Recently, while talking about militancy in Jammu and Kashmir, Chief of Defence Staff General Bipin Rawat spoke about the need for de-radicalization camps in order to counter radicalization in Jammu and Kashmir. And he also controversially stated that the people of Kashmir are ready to lynch terrorists in order to counter Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. But the writer, who is an army veteran, states that these statements of the CDS reflects the harsh approach of the Indian state, which has led to the clubbing of alienated, misled youth with hardcore terrorists. The writer says that while a harsh response is needed to counter hardcore terrorists, you can't employ the same hard approach to deal with alienated, misled youth. So he calls for a clear distinction to be made over here and points out the need for adopting a professional, softer approach to stem the sense of alienation being faced by Kashmiri youth. See, the conflict zone in Jammu and Kashmir today is a complex theatre, and to understand the various factors responsible for radicalization in Jammu and Kashmir, you need to trace back the history of J&K and understand how Pakistan has used religion as a potent weapon against India, particularly in Jammu and Kashmir. See, the process of religion-based radicalization started in Pakistan under the dictator president General Zia-ul Haq. He openly advocated that religion should be an essential part of state policy and statecraft and enabled the mixing of religion into geopolitics. So Pakistan, as a part of its state policy, started the Islamization of the country, where it started breeding radical ideology and religious indoctrination through madrasas. This directly led to the rise of religious extremism in Pakistan, which later spilled over into Jammu and Kashmir in the 1980s. See, since independence, that is since 1947, Pakistan has been meddling in Jammu and Kashmir, not just to annex the territory, but also to destabilize India. After fighting unsuccessful wars aimed at the annexation of J&K, Pakistan adopted a strategy of covert proxy war against India in order to liberate J&K from India. The policies of General Zia-ul Haq started having its impact in 1970s, when we witnessed a sudden surge in religious extremism in Pakistan, followed by Pakistan's direct role in creating the Afghan Mujahideen in order to support the United States in Afghanistan to overthrow the occupying Soviet forces. So as Pakistan tasted success in this religion-fueled covert proxy war in Afghanistan, It extended the same strategy to Jammu and Kashmir as well in the 1980s. The 1987 state elections opened up this opportunity for Pakistan because it was widely alleged that these elections were rigged by India in order to favor dynastic politics of Abdullah family, which had been desisted by the people of Jammu and Kashmir for several years, as such dynastic politics, led by the Abdullah family and the Mufti family, had failed to bring any development to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So during the 1987 elections, there was a wide perception that dynastic politics in the state would be defeated. But contrary to these expectations, the election results went the other way, thereby leading to rumors that India had meddled with the elections to favor these selected political parties. This widespread allegation became the immediate trigger for the breakout of violence and insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, and it essentially represented the outburst of resentment and frustration that had been building up in the state following decades of poor development and governance deficit in the state. So, as these strong anti India sentiments took root in Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan immediately capitalized on it and quickly turned this into an insurgent movement by infiltrating terrorists from across the border, who were none other than the terrorists who were radicalized and trained by Pakistan in Afghanistan and Pakistan itself. So, as cross border terrorism began in J&K, India responded to this grave security threat with a harsh security response. India immediately brought in the stringent provisions of the Public Safety Act of 1978 and the AFSPA, or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, so that the Indian security forces, led by the Indian Army and Central Armed Police Forces like CRPF and BSF, along with the J&K State Police, could respond appropriately to tackle the cross-border terrorist threat that was emanating from Pakistan. The writer completely agrees that such a harsh response was necessary in the 1980s and 1990s, as most of these terrorists were coming from neighboring Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they were acting at the behest of the Pakistani state. So this was nothing short of a covert proxy war, and to deal with the security threat, India had every right to respond to it with the harshest security measures possible. But however, in the 1990s and early 2000s, the nature of insurgency started changing in J&K. In the 1990s, for the first time, local Kashmiri youth who were either misled or threatened were forced to seek the help of Pakistan in giving birth to homegrown militancy in Jammu and Kashmir. Initially in the 1980s, when the insurgency began, the radicalism and terrorism was largely imported from Pakistan. But as the Kashmiri youth felt alienated by the Indian state due to its harsh security response, and as radicalization and indoctrination crept into J&K, it gave birth to local insurgency with the rise of homegrown militants. So this not only increased the scale of terror attacks in J&K, but it also gave rise to new security challenges, as several radicalized and misled youth started taking up stone pelting against the security forces, and many of them were even resorting to violent riots against the Indian state. So the rise of homegrown militancy and radicalism created new challenges for the Indian security forces, because now they were not only dealing with foreign terrorists sponsored by Pakistan, but they also had to deal with radicalized local youth who were Indian citizens. So the inability of the Indian state to distinguish between the two led to a harsh security response against the Indian youth as well, thereby further alienating the Kashmiri youth from mainstream India. Following the rise in stone pelting incidents and violent mobs and riots, the Indian forces resorted to the usage of the controversial pellet guns, which are known to cause grave injuries and even death. And as per a UN report, several young children have also been killed and gravely injured due to the controversial usage of these pellet guns. According to a government report, more than 6,000 people, many of them civilians, have been gravely injured. And such incidents, according to the writer, has further instigated the locals against the Indian state. So according to the writer, the harsh security approach against Indian citizens has led to a general sense of alienation amongst the youth. And along with this, the discrimination faced by young Kashmiri students across India, and also the religiously motivated violence against them, in several parts of northern India has further let them feel disconnected from India. Of late, there have been incidents in several parts of northern India where Kashmiri students in colleges have been targeted in what appears to be cases of religious violence, especially when there are terror attacks in J&K or even after a high intensity cricket match between India and Pakistan. So these incidents of mistreatment of the Kashmiri youth in other parts of India and the breach of their constitutional rights, sometimes with the security forces, has led to a strong sense of alienation amongst the Kashmiri youth. Hence, the writer argues that in such an environment, suggestion of de-radicalization camps can be very controversial because that could be equated with China's de-radicalization camps in the Xinjiang province, which is aimed at the Uyghur Muslims and has been widely believed to have contributed to violation of human rights and religious rights. So, in such an environment of distrust, discrimination, and hatred, if the state sets up de radicalization camps, it would be seen as targeting of Kashmiri youth on the lines of religion, and also encouraging approaches such as lynching of terrorists could lead to a vigilante approach where citizens might take law into their own hands and target innocent Kashmiri youth by branding them as terrorists. According to the writer, such approaches will only lead to more hostility on the ground, and hence he calls for the adoption of a more professional, softer approach with a long term strategy. Here he cites the example of civic action programs being implemented by our security forces in the conflict zone of Jammu and Kashmir. See, civic action programs are implemented by security forces in a conflict zone in order to win the hearts and minds of the local people. As a part of this approach, the Indian Army has been sponsoring the training and education of students in Jammu and Kashmir under the Army Welfare Education Society as part of Operation Sadbhavana, which is aimed at reaching out to the local people in order to build a bridge of trust between the security force and the local people. On similar lines, J&K police and even the BSF often organize Bharat Darshan for students from Jammu and Kashmir so that they get to travel to different parts of India to feel connected by better understanding the history and development of other parts of the country. The security forces take up many such educational, skill development, and training programs as a part of their civic action initiative, and they even assist the local administration in creating necessary infrastructure such as roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, etc. While these softer initiatives have seen limited success, they have not been entirely successful because most of the youth who are selected under these training and educational programs are not essentially from the militancy prone areas. So the writer is calling upon the Indian government, the J&K administration, and all the security forces deployed in the region to work out such innovative, softer approaches which can provide a long term strategy to win the hearts and minds of the Kashmiri youth while continuing to deal with terrorists in the harshest manner possible. Now let's take up an article from page number 9 that deals with India's relations with Bangladesh. As India and Bangladesh are all set to mark Maitri Divas, the two countries are further looking to deepen their relationship. See, Maitri Divas will be celebrated on the 6th of December to mark the 50th year of independence of Bangladesh, as India not only played a direct role in the liberation of Bangladesh, but was also the first country to recognize the independence of Bangladesh. This was also the day when India-Bangladesh established their official diplomatic relations in 1971, and the two countries marked this glorious moment by celebrating Maitri Divas. In the run-up to this event, India-Bangladesh are looking to promote their trade and economic relations, and the two countries will be organizing the India-Bangladesh CEO Forum so that both the countries can work towards finalizing a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. This agreement intends to promote free trade between the two countries in order to deepen their economic relations and to further step up bilateral trade between the two. See, today, Bangladesh has not only emerged as one of the major economies of South Asia, but it has also achieved tremendous socio-economic progress, and recently it has been elevated from a less developed country to a developing country. Bangladesh has done phenomenally well in various areas of socio-economic development, including in the field of education, healthcare, nutrition, employment, and microfinance. Upon this, Bangladesh also happens to be India's largest trading partner in South Asia, with the bilateral trade volume crossing $10 billion. India has played a direct role in this economic transformation of Bangladesh by not only extending line of credit to the tune of $8 billion, which has been invested in key infrastructure projects in the country, but has also helped in boosting connectivity with India. The two countries also cooperate extensively in key sectors like textiles, and both the countries have also successfully ensured that their supply chains remained uninterrupted even during the pandemic. Then, upon this, India is building two special economic zones in Bangladesh, which are coming up at Mir Sarai and at the strategic Mongla port. So, to take forward this bilateral trading relationship, five focus areas have been identified by the two countries, which includes technology, connectivity, entrepreneurship, health, and tourism. So, with these objectives and focus areas in mind, the India Bangladesh CEO Forum Summit is being organized in order to lay the groundwork for a free trade agreement between the two countries, known as the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, let's look at this infographic from page number 7, which depicts the digital divide in India's education. See, as the pandemic broke out, most of the schools and colleges shifted to online education and e learning, thereby raising concerns with regard to digital equity among students. So, in this regard, the infographic brought out by the Hindu provides a few important facts. According to ground level data, smartphone availability among school children has nearly doubled from 36.5% in 2018 to 67.6% in 2021. But according to the study, only around 25% of them could actually access the smartphones for their studies whenever they wanted. Then, if you look at this table over here, it clearly points to the digital divide between government schools and private schools. The data shows that students studying in government institutions have lower access to smartphones, whereas those studying in private institutions have a higher access to smartphones and internet. Then, with regard to smartphone availability, the parents' educational status also had a role to play. The table over here clearly shows that if the parents of the children were highly educated, then the chances are very high that the children will have easier access to smartphones. But those parents with lower education find it harder to provide smartphone access to their children who are studying. Although 28% of the households bought a new smartphone for helping their children study after the lockdown began, there is clearly a state-wise divide that has also emerged. More developed states such as Kerala report better access, and this has been clearly depicted in this chart over here. Kerala was the only major state where more than 50% of school students could access a smartphone for their studies at all times. It reports an access rate of 76.2%, whereas in backward states like Bihar, 54% of the school children could not access smartphones despite having one device at home, and Bihar's access rate stands at just around 11.8%. So this data can provide valuable points which we can include in our mains answers while talking about digital divide and digital equity in education, especially after the pandemic broke out. Then finally, take a look at this editorial on page number 6. It refers to a recent ruling of the Supreme Court where it has questioned the center as to on what basis it fixed the income limit while providing reservation to the EWS category or the economically weaker sections. This topic has been covered in detail in our yesterday's analysis, so I would request you to watch the video once and then go through the editorial. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: in the context of climate action, developing economies such as India are burdened with several challenges and require the help of the developed North. Hence, it is argued that to fulfill COP26 pledges, The world needs a new climate of cooperation. Discuss. The second question. Experts have argued that there is a high sense of alienation amongst Kashmiri youth owing to the nature of security response of the Indian state against cross-border terrorism. In the light of this, suggest a softer approach that could be adopted to win the hearts and minds of young Kashmiris at the grassroots. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.